Hi, Avni. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. Welcome to the Kenyon review. I am so excited for your book. Like, I'm going to hold it up now. Burnt Sugar. And in India, it's Girl in White Cotton, right?
Yeah.
And in the States, it isn't out yet, and which is sort of a travesty, in my opinion, that it isn't out yet. This is such a stunning cover. And also, like, oh my goodness, this picture. It's before I begin to congratulate you on the Booker and everything, just tell me about this picture.
So my editor in the UK, she knew I have a ton of spiky plants in my garden in Dubai. I live in Dubai. And so she said, can you, to go with the cover, can you take some pictures with your spiky plants? And that's what I did. So that's what you
So,
see. I took them myself using a tripod. So
so it's sort of a self-portrait. It came out really well. I love it because it's so unapologetically serious and sort of to steal a phrase is like very, very fierce. And I feel like the book is like that. The book is exactly like that. But before I go into that, I just want to say congratulations on the long list and short list for the Booker. That must feel amazing. That must feel absolutely amazing. And for me, as somebody who's from India, like especially this book that doesn't stereotype the experience of Indians, what is expected, sort of Indian writing that is expected, that is about poverty or about terrorism or about the jungles or things like that. It means a lot to see such a book nominated. Like, how do you feel?
Um, it's amazing. It's surreal. I don't know if it's really sunk in fully. I think it might never sink in fully. I think, like, how do you think about these kinds of things? They feel a bit too large,
Yeah.
in a way. So there's that element to it. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad that people are seeing that. I'm so grateful about what you just said, because I'm glad people are seeing that aspect of the book, that it maybe looks at a different India than the cliche, I
Hmm.
suppose. So yeah, I'm really excited.
Well, I'm happy for you. I can't wait for November 19th, and obviously rooting for you and for you to win this. But I mean, you know what you said, that it isn't that cliched idea of India. And when you started to write the book, did you set out to do that, or the story demanded that you write, the story demanded that it not be that cliched idea of India that people have already seen?
So actually, when I started writing it, now it's 8 years ago, I was pretty much only writing about the ashram. The entire
Okay.
novel actually took place in the ashram, and it was all from the perspective of the narrator as a child.
Oh, wow.
So it was a very different book. And you might say, because it was only about the ashram, maybe it was kind of a bit more of a Indian cliche in a sense. But I'll be really honest, I wasn't thinking about cliche or not cliche, or is this a different kind of India? None of that was my goal. I was really focused on the character, and it was really about the story I wanted to tell through her. So the other parts, during the writing process felt a bit more incidental.
Hmm. So, to go off of that, there's this interview that my mom sent me. Like, she loves your book, by the way, and she sent it to me. And I have to say this, I was surprised at how much she loves your book, because it's such it's a book about mothers and daughters and grandmothers, and it's so complicated and spiky and just wonderfully unsettling. And so she had sent me this interview that she had read in India, and in the interview you said, like, I had to change and evolve as a person in order to write the book. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that, like, because obviously the book has gone through a sea change. The book is no longer set in the ashram. The ashram is, I mean, it's distilled into just a few pages now. The metamorphosis of this book has been incredible from what you've just told me. So I guess I want to know, like, what, like, explain to me the change and evolving in order for you to be able to write the version of the book that we have the privilege to read now?
I think I really had to, my entire relationship with myself had to change. I really had to give myself a kind of permission to write this book. Well, first of all, I didn't know how to write when I started. I didn't know at all what I was doing. As I've said in a couple of other interviews, I had never done any creative writing classes. Only after I had written the first, maybe even the second draft, did I end up doing a writing fellowship in the UK. So it was only then that I actually even found out that there was a thing called craft. I had like no idea what I was doing. So I think in that sense, it was a kind of metamorphosis, because I learned how to write through the actual process. But if you consider the actual amount of time that it took, like the actual duration of time that it took for me to write the book, 7 years. I mean, at the start of it, I was a completely different person. I wasn't married. I didn't have children. I was living in a different place. I was, working in a particular place, and it was just a completely different world, in fact. And if you think about how much you change in 7 years, it might give you a sense of how different I am. And I think the person I am now could not have written the novel in the way that I wrote it all those years ago. So as I changed, the book changed, and I think I probably became a little braver in some ways. I think I became, maybe less courageous in some ways. Um, I don't know. I'm trying to think now. Maybe there were things I was willing to talk about back then that I'm a little more afraid to talk about now. But overall, I think I'm a lot more comfortable saying things that people don't necessarily want to hear, or that make other people uncomfortable. I think I tried to be more palatable before. Maybe I was a bit more of a people pleaser before, not just in my writing, but maybe in my personality as well. So I think that's all shifted in a way.
That's fascinating. I mean, can you like draw a clear line between something in the plot or in the story that changed drastically, like, or that made you more courageous or less courageous as time has gone by?
I think the voice. I think the quality of the voice was so different. I think that there were a lot of white spaces, a lot of blank spaces, a lot of spaces of silence
Mm-hmm.
that were there in the first couple of drafts. And it's interesting. I think there are still these kind of spaces of silence in the novel, but I think they're different ones. So I think, there were things that I wasn't so comfortable saying before that I'm comfortable saying now. And so I was able to kind of fill those places in. And then there were other things that I decided I wanted to remove. Can I think of a particular plot
Or
point?
like not even plot point, like something like a decision you made in the writing. Like I can see what you mean by the voice. I mean, I remember reading the first line of your novel and
Yeah.
being like, holy shit. Like I read it out to two other friends that I was Skyping with or Zooming with. I'm sorry, I'm just going to read out your lines back to you, because this is how it's the first line is like, I would be lying if I said my mother's misery has never given me pleasure. I was just like, wow, I don't know if there's a single person who hasn't thought this. Like I feel like I know a lot of people who have had this moment in
Yeah.
their life and then felt shitty about the fact that they feel this way. But there's just something, I read that and I was like, all right, the tone set, this is going to be brutal, but also heartbreaking.
And I think that's exactly what you just pointed out. That's something that I had to come to. That's something that I had to kind of grow into. This wasn't a revenge story
Yeah.
back when I started, and it
Right.
became one. It became a story about a woman, a young woman coming into her aggression. And it wasn't that before.
I
I think
love
that,
that.
yeah.
I love that, the idea, this young woman coming into her aggression, but also that it is a revenge story. Like I always think about the Count of Monte Cristo and how that seems to be the archetype of like the revenge story, right? But of course, it's a man, and men conduct themselves in a particular way, and it's written at a particular time. And here is a woman who has to inhabit all these gray spaces and has to you really capture the way in which women have to do everything. Like they have to pull a house together, they have to present themselves a particular way, and all this time she's also sort of plotting, enacting a revenge, which then she has to stop, right? And I don't want to give it away, that's why I'm saying enacting a revenge. I'm not trying to say what she does, but I love this idea that she's coming into her aggression, this thing. And because of the subtle and beautiful way that this is written, like you don't even realize until you're well into that section of the story what's going on, because it isn't, your smash and plot thing. This is a beautiful literary novel that's trying to get at like people, right? Like it's trying to get at emotions, it's trying to get at, it changes you in a way, like it disturbs you and changes you. Because I know I felt very disturbed and changed at the end, and I had to like go for a walk, and I came back and I reread the book again. And it was a delight. It was such a delight, but also so uncomfortable. So thank you for like explaining like that, the voice, and like how she comes into revenge. And I guess like with revenge, it's also tied to memory so much. I was watching on Netflix, they have these great series, which is like The Vote Explained with Vox, or like Coronavirus Explained, or Memory, like the mind explained. And there's a scientist in there, like I want to say she's a scientist, who says like 50% of our memories change within a year, but we are 100% convinced we're 100% convinced that we are right. And I was just thinking about how, I mean, this book is all about memory, right? Like we dip in and out of it. Her childhood, our narrator's childhood, defines her so completely. And um, and also one of the things that they said in the documentary is like that our brain is associative. Like we're always like associating things, and we're always trying to find an association with things. And I guess like I wanted to ask, like, what about memory was fascinating to you? Why was it so necessary? Or what about this story? What about the genesis of this story made you focus so much on memory?
Again, I don't think I set out to focus on memory. I don't know. I've always found memory like deeply compelling. I read Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I read 100 Years of Solitude when I was in my early 20s. And I just, there's that scene where the whole village is losing their memory. They're all kind
Yeah.
of beset with amnesia. And one of the Buendias is kind of, I don't remember which one. He's got a plan. He's going to label everything, and he just sets about, labeling everything around him, pen, paper, book, everything. And it's only days later that he realizes that he is actually going to eventually lose the value of each letter. So he will actually not be able to read, and how this is kind of this pointless, fruitless exercise. And that scene stayed with me, and it just kind of like, I don't know, I felt my heart kind of go into my stomach when I read it. It was like, just kind of really shocked me and stayed with me. And I ended up curating a show about that scene. I used that scene I worked in the art world for a while in India, and I curated an entire show where the curatorial note was that particular scene. And so it was always kind of there. It was always a central interest for me. I didn't set out to have memory be such a central theme in the novel. It kind of happened organically. I guess, our preoccupations show up without you having to really plan for it or think about it. And that was another really interesting thing for me while I was writing, particularly this draft that you see that's been published. I didn't really plan for the different threads of memory to come together in this way. There was no like grand scheme to kind of draw these different aspects together. It really felt like it happened quite organically. And then I also had this strange, somewhat spooky thing happen where I felt in a way as though life and art were starting to kind of mirror each other, because about 4 years ago, my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And even though memory was kind of already in the novel in a smaller way, I did a deep dive in my personal life into all the research around Alzheimer's disease. And it was sort of through the process of me making sense of all the research I was doing, that, you know, all the data and all the information slowly, you know, got fed into the novel itself. And yeah, so I don't know. I feel like memory and amnesia and I don't know, these things are not just themes in the book. They might even just be themes in my life, or just the things that I'm drawn to. I don't know.
No. I mean, so first I have like two separate things that I want to ask you. So one of it has to do with the fact that your protagonist and is also part of the art world, creates art, you know, in the novel, and also does a deep dive, does all this research, and then of course she gets shut down by the doctors in these interesting ways and very real ways, actually, which I feel like women face a lot when they go to the when they go to the doctor or they go to the hospital. They're often like discouraged in what they believe is wrong with them. It takes a lot for them to be heard. So there's this one part where obviously elements of your own life have come in. And the second thing I want to ask you is, and please answer them in any order you like, but the second thing I was going to ask is, at some point when we were setting up this interview, we had talked a little bit about how you had initially plotted this book, and in the final drafts of this, the plot just went out and you wrote it because you knew the story really well. So I guess I wanted to ask both these things. Like, the one, I wanted to just ask you about, you know, this idea of using your life but curating it, or like structuring it in a work of fiction. And the other thing I just wanted to ask is just like a more technical craft question for the writing of the novel, like how eventually you didn't use a plot anymore, you know, to write the final drafts, and the beautiful draft that we've ended up with, the final product that we've ended up with.
Yeah. So in terms of my life feeding into the novel, I think, you know, if you look at my life and the narrator's life, in some ways, they really don't resemble each other at all. But it was kind of, again, a sort of organic process that my knowledge would enter the novel in a way. And so, for example, in the novel, the protagonist, the narrator, she is an artist. I was never an artist. I wish I was an artist. I was
Well,
an
you
art
are an artist. You're an artist now.
Yeah. But I studied art history. So I studied artists and their lives and their work. And so I guess, and I think it's probably natural that one's, you know, all the knowledge that you have about different subjects will kind of feed into your creative work in different ways. But in terms of her making sense of her mother's Alzheimer's disease through her artwork, yes, that's definitely a parallel, because I was definitely using, you know, I've said this in other interviews, but I was definitely using the novel to make sense of what I was going through with my grandmother. It was kind of too intense and large and difficult for me to wrap my head around. I had no idea I was researching all these different modalities of healing and, different like theories about what Alzheimer's was, but it was really too much for me to make sense of. And also she's my grandmother, so I had my mother to contend with, I had my mother's sisters to contend with, and they all wanted and still want to look after her in a particular way. And so I was kind of pushed to the side, and all my efforts I felt were like getting frustrated. And so I think maybe I needed something to do with all the information I had and all the energy I had. And so I guess I put it in this fictional world.
And you,
Sorry,
I was just like, and do you ever worry, like I hear this a lot, or like I come across this a lot, that a lot of writers who are women, who identify as women, they often get whatever they write, at first people wonder if it's autobiographical, whereas it happens less and less with men. And is that a concern of yours, or is that just, a byproduct of the work that you do and you're fine with what people think?
Look, it is a concern in that I think it's completely sexist to just assume that a woman can only write, exactly what she's lived with any authority or authenticity. And I think that's also absolutely ridiculous. But at the same time, I have to write what makes sense to me, what feels true. And I have to write something that's meaningful, I guess. And, Pune is not a city I grew up in, but it's a city my mother grew up in. I grew up in the States. And so definitely there are aspects of my life, and there are aspects of my emotional life that have fed into the novel. But my standard answer when people ask me the autobiography question is no, because what does it mean? What does it mean for something to be autobiography? Then it should be factually, in my opinion, it should have a kind of factual rigor to it, that follows a person's life. And this novel doesn't. So I think, the answer that I usually go to when I feel that there's this kind of suggestion about a kind of sexist suggestion, is that no, it's not autobiography. And it's not. I think that's a fair answer.
Oh, yeah.
But if you want me to if you're asking me genuinely, like, how did these, and I think there is, I don't think that there's anything negative or wrong with life feeding into art. I just don't. I think that's a natural and normal kind of flow. And I think even the reverse happens, as I just mentioned. So I don't have an issue with it in principle. It's more sometimes the assumptions behind it are just troubling to me.
No, I understand what you mean. And yeah, well, I'll let you answer the second part of the question, which is the craft question that I'd asked.
What was the second part? Sorry.
Oh, right. No, that's totally fine. Like, I mean,
I have a bad memory.
You probably have the kind of memory that, when you need the information, it's right there available. And when it's not necessary, you just shuffle it back. Well, I wanted to ask, because we had talked about the fact that, oh my goodness, I'm having a moment now. Oh yes, that you first plotted the novel out, like initially when you were getting started, and then eventually in the writing of the various drafts, the plot, I guess, didn't matter. And I think my craft question is, like, how did that come about? Like, how did eventually you write the book without any of your note cards, or whatever process that you used?
So I'm not sure if, first of all, I've only written one book, so I don't know if
book.
I don't know if this is true, what I'm about to say, but I imagine it's true. I think every book has its own way that it needs to be written. So I don't think I'll necessarily follow this kind of a process again.
Sure.
I certainly hope I don't have to spend 7 years on the next one. I didn't know any other way when I started out besides kind of plotting and besides, thinking, okay, besides understanding that, okay, you know, this is kind of an intro and then there has to be some kind of climax. And then, you know, so I had an idea in my mind of what a novel had to look like. And that's what I used. And I really plotted, as you said, the first, I think at least 3 or 4 drafts, I think were like extremely plotted. And then it became a little less. And what I realized is that even though each draft was a complete disaster, before I got to this one, I realized that I was learning about my characters, learning about the setting, I was sort of refining as I went along, distilling, as you said. And once I got to, you know, the 8th and final draft, I didn't need to plot anymore because I kind of knew the story so well. I knew the characters. I mean, I had drafts. I think one of the drafts actually had a large section that went back to the grandparents' generation. And it, like a big part of the story kind of happened during and around partition. And so it was just, I mean, it was just like a completely different novel spanning a completely different historical moment.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I felt when I was coming to this particular draft, I knew like the ancestral line of this family, basically. So I just felt really comfortable in a way. I just felt like I know this person. And maybe that's why, you know, I've said before that I really heard the voice in my head. Maybe that's why her voice, you know, Antara's voice, the narrator's voice, was so clear to me, because I felt like I knew everything about her. Although still, when I wrote this draft, especially when I got towards the end, I was surprised by what came up. I was surprised by what she wanted to do. I was surprised in a way of what she was capable of what she was convincing herself was acceptable behavior. So I think even though I felt on one hand, and I guess in a way that was a nice balance, because on one hand I felt I really knew so much about the characters and the story, and I knew in a way what was going to come, but at the same time, because there was no sense of plot, I was surprised when I got to certain points. And, you know, I felt like, I guess in a way that made the book feel really alive to me. That was another issue I had when I plotted too much. I would try to kind of force the narrative in a particular way, but it was just artificial, because I could feel that there were tensions in the story pulling me in other directions, but I was kind of forcing the story in a certain way to get to that climactic point. And then I would get there and it would just feel so like lifeless and dead. And there would be no tension in the language or, you know, in that moment for the characters. And so I think that's something that I found works really well when you avoid plotting. It maybe keeps a bit of tension, because you yourself as the writer are not really certain. And I think that uncertainty is probably quite powerful.
I love that. I love that, because I think you've got the best of both worlds. I know there are writers who say they write to discover, like that idea of aliveness, because they don't know exactly what's going to happen. And then I believe Colson Whitehead said this, that, you know, the writing process is so hard, like the sentence to sentence, that he has to have everything plotted out. But I feel like what's interesting is that, and I imagine it's like the big plot points, you know, sort of plotted out, and then the rest is the writing that you discover through writing. And I love that, because I think what has happened here is that you knew these people so well that when you were writing these final drafts, you didn't need anything. You just knew that. And then the discovery. And you've talked about the end, and oh my gosh, that ending. I mean, I remember looking at it, I was like, does the mom know what she's doing? And like, does Antara know? There is such a hostility and terror there. there's hostility, there's terror, but in the way that only the people who love us can instill in us. The people that we love the most, the people who have the most mileage in our lives. For I don't know why I'm using a car metaphor, but using mileage as a way to, but like the people who have like the most traction in our lives, the people who can sort of like, and I was fascinated and disturbed and terrified myself by it. And then she goes out, and I'm not giving anything away, and she comes back in, and I'm just sort of like, wow, that ending is just, there's something unhinged about it, and it's wonderful that it's so wonderfully unhinged and that she's so flawed. And this sort of leads me to the next thing that I wanted to ask you about is, and you also brought up the fact that there was a whole chunk in your book about the grandparents. And, you know, I imagine not just the partition, but the grandparents' marriage would have fed into it, because this is about three marriage. I feel like there's three generations of marriages here. The grandparents' marriage is not explored as much anymore in this, but there's obviously her parents' marriage and what the mother does and what the father does, and the father's second marriage, and her own marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this was so interesting how three generations of marriages have led to this moment, because she is both being very traditional and untraditional. Like her marriage is both those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, like talking about marriage, and especially where you've talked about, like, it feels sometimes we write and we predict what's going to happen in our worlds. And that's terrifying, to make that sort of bizarre prediction. Anyways, so I guess what I'm asking is, there are all these marriages in this story, in this beautiful, complicated novel. And could you talk to me about just the marriages?
Yeah, so the grandparents' marriage, as you said, is just really mentioned in a couple of lines. I think I
Yeah.
make reference to the fact that the grandmother had many miscarriages and the grandfather had many affairs or something. There's a couple of sentences in there, but obviously that was an entire narrative, like, thread that went through previous drafts. Yeah, I was interested in marriage as a kind of, deeply difficult patriarchal institution. So I was interested in it from that perspective. I was interested in it even from a kind of romantic perspective. I was thinking about marriage as a kind of contract, marriage as a kind of business deal, marriage as a wedding ceremony, as a kind of religious sacrament or blessing. I was thinking about it in all those different ways. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about marriage in the novel is that even though there are a lot of marriages in the novel, I think the central relationships are not necessarily marriages.
Yep.
So the central kind of, the relationship between mother and daughter, the relationship between grandmother and granddaughter, the relationship between even father and daughter, which is, I guess, the kind of absence of relationship, because, the narrator doesn't really have a great relationship with her father. And then the relationship with a lover, the relationship with your mother's lover. So there are all these other relationships that kind of exist outside of marriage that, in a way, are the kind of the more interesting ones, that are kind of the more, some of them are more taboo. And they're all kind of more, they have that space around them where they're all a bit more subversive, I think, in general.
Oh no, I agree with you. I loved I'm so sorry to cut you off. I was just going to say, I'm so ridiculously excited. I was going to say, that's what I loved. I was like, there were all these marriages. And at the same time, all the women in these marriages were was sort of breaking that. Like they were doing all the taboo things, and at the end the marriages were not as important. I feel like, especially with Antara and her mother, Antara's marriage, her husband is almost like a weapon between them, more than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, I've said this before, so I hope I'm not repeating myself too much, but I feel with marriage, it's like a lot of those kind of patriarchal forces in our lives where it forms this larger structure that confines us in certain ways. But at the same time, once you are inside that confinement, you almost forget it's there, if that makes sense. So in the same way that you kind of forget, it's like you kind of forget the patriarchy even exists around you to some degree, right? Because it's like a fish in water. It's everywhere and it's everything. Yep. So it's like asking the fish about the water. And,
that's such a great analogy. That makes total sense. And then it makes also sense that why then the novel concentrates on the things that really, in a way, that they have control over. The thing that she can do, after all, her mother is her mother. And she has to be there for her mother in many ways that the husband can't, or can only be there in a peripheral sort of way.
And then I think there's also this question about what is actually the most dangerous force at work in the novel. Is it this damaging, traumatic relationship, that's destroyed her, potentially, the one with her mother?
Right.
Or is it the one that she can't really hold in her hand? Is it the one that's kind of constantly slipping out of her grasp? Which one should she actually be more worried about? There are a couple of moments when there are, actually some of the scariest moments. You talked about the end, but for me, maybe as a married person, one of the scariest moments in the novel, at least from the perspective of being inside the narrator's head for me when I was writing, was when she thinks for a second that she wants to leave.
Oh, yeah.
And she packs up her jewelry and she takes her passport and she gets in the car and she's like ready to go. And then she realizes there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go to. There's no, to me, that was like this actual kind of moment of holy shit, like terror,
No, I know what you're talking about, because I think what the real craft, I think, in this book is like how the terror that there are two terrors in her life. There's the thing that's happening with her mom, right? And there's also the secret, like she's been drawing this one thing all the time, and then eventually that secret is revealed. Like, I think you thread it so well, like it slowly keeps coming up, the one thing that she's been obsessing about. The mother knows what it is in her sort of like half cognizant, not cognizant state, and she's hiding it even from herself in a way, like not ready to admit whose picture it is. And then on the other hand, there is the terror with the husband. Like, she has married this person who's from the US, of Indian origin, and is interested in Pune, but also not. There's this like complicated stuff that's going on in that particular moment. And I think the terror, what you're talking about, is it's exchangeable. Like that, there's the terror of what's happening with the mother, but there's also the terror of the relationship, which is not entirely set. Like, yes, she's married to him and etc. And exactly what you're talking about as a married person too. Like, there have been moments when I just honed in on that part and I was like barely able to like sort of breathe. And that's the beauty of this, because it's not just uncomfortable with the mother-daughter relationship. It makes you realize that all of life is so uncertain, that we don't know what we want. And then when we finally figure it out, then we realize we don't know how to make that happen. And then and then you kind of go back, and then your own desire changes for what you want and the things that you care about, and like so much of that. And I thought that was amazing, that the novel captures our day-to-day shifting desires, and also the fact that the macro and micro moments, like the big moments and the small moments. And in that way, yeah. So
Somebody just the other day, a friend of mine, actually, she used a particular term for that, a particular phrase for that moment in the novel. She called it the myth. She referred to the myth of female autonomy.
hmm.
And I was like, wow, yeah, that is what it is. You know, there's this feeling in her marriage that everything is fine, that everything is wonderful, that everything is great, until you want to leave, until you want to exercise your agency over, you know, until you want to have authority over your own life. And then you realize that it is a complex web that you are caught in. And there is no leaving, because there is nothing outside of that.
Yeah, and I also wonder how much of it is like in the book, but also beyond the book, in the world, also how much we play into it, like how much we want to be caught in that web and we don't realize it until we want to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the book also does that. Like, at least it makes you ask that question,
Mm-hmm.
which is what makes this book such a complicated, wonderful book. Like, because it does that, it makes you uncomfortable and makes you ask questions that you weren't really prepared to ask yourself.
Yeah.
And that's I feel like the marriage, the various marriages are a character in the book. You know, just like you mentioned that Puna is a character in the book, and I've thought about this a great deal. And I spoke to the people. Like, my father's very well read, and I was chatting with him and some of my other friends, and we can't think of like a book that's set in Pune. Although I have friends who went to school, and now I've like went to university, then I've given them all this book, and I'm like, you guys should read and tell me what you think about, you know. And definitely there is this middle class existence, which is what was fascinating for me here, that you've tapped into an existence that millions of Indians experience, where you've got poverty on the streets, but it doesn't affect you. You go to the club, like whether it's the Gymkhana club or the club that's there in Pune, you know, the club that she's a member of, that she thought she would never be a member of, Antara. And you really capture what it's like to be Indian in India and to live in that way, you know, where so much is going on around you, which people who don't live there, or perhaps who are coming from the West, or from countries that are just economically better developed, or religiously different, they don't, when they come to India, they have a shock, right? And whereas when you live in India, it's a completely, your experience, your existence is different. And I thought this was the interesting, fascinating part, that you've tapped into this really important set of lives that people are living, this sort of middle class life.
Yeah, I was thinking about the experience of India, or the idea of this experience. You know, the experience of India there is an experience that is completely on the streets, that, you know, has to do with, I don't know, going to a slum, or going, you know, and that also is kind of something in the foreign imagination,
Mm-hmm.
right? A kind of
Or the
exotic
street beggars, you know, you're in the
beggars,
car.
with
Yeah.
the colors and
Yeah.
the, you know, I don't
Sure.
know.
No, you got it right. All the bright
You know,
colors. Sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
But that was never my experience of India. My experience of India was its domestic spaces.
Mm-hmm.
My experience of India was being shuttled around in an air-conditioned car, and going from the house to the club, now maybe to a shopping mall, or to going to see a film, but not, I mean, you know, Pune was never for me a pedestrian experience. It was never that kind of life. So yeah, I was interested in how the city, you know, and I think it's interesting that people think that the city is a character in the novel. I can see that, but I also think in some ways the city is a kind of absence in the novel, because a lot of the descriptions of the city are, she's kind of an outsider to a lot of those experiences. You know, she's sitting in a rickshaw and everything is going so fast, she's not able to pick up, but you know, she can pick up her favorite biscuit place, or she can pick up these few places that she goes to, and those are very kind of real. Or, you know, there's one place where she and her husband have a funny anecdote about the sign of the, you know, whatever it is, a hair salon or something. And so that's kind of there in more detail. But the rest of the city is, she's really blind to it in a way. It is a kind of blind spot for her because it's just rushing by so fast, you know?
Yep. Yes, that's, and I think what I should have said is it sort of reminds me of a minor character in a Dickensian novel. Like in Dickens, it's sort of like, I think about Madame Defarge. And now I feel so ridiculous. And in A Tale of Two Cities, where Madame Defarge, all she does is she's sort of knitting behind a bar. And then you realize later on she's actually been knitting all these codes. Like she's a spy and she's got all this code stuff. But because Dickens does this, like all his minor characters, whether they're flat or not, he gives them something really pointed, something really specific to do. And because of that, we never sort of forget them. Or like when I think about Little Dorrit and the Panks character, you know, like he's this horrible guy who goes around collecting rent, and he has a very specific way of, you know, talking. And then you realize actually he's not the bad guy. You know, there's someone else behind him, but the thing that makes him dogged in his pursuit for the rent is also what makes him great at investigation. And I think Poona as a character for me reminds me of that. It's a minor character, but it's sort of this, I don't know, the way that you talked about it, I could smell it. The way you wrote about it, I could smell it, I could feel it. I have never been to Poona. I've been to Mumbai, of course. I've had friends talk about Poona, but I can imagine Poona from your book. I can imagine it from the way that they've talked about. And I love the fact that you're saying it's missing. And you're right. Because what is Dickensian about it is just that the club is, you know, we know that Poona has this club. We know we have those moments when the narrator and her mother end up like sitting outside that club. Again, I don't want to give it away, so I'm just saying they're sitting outside the club. You know, the things that are happening to them. And I do think it's very that, like, there's exactly the thing, like she knows the things that she wants, the things that she knows she has to go, the domestic things, like the biscuit thing, or the bar that the husband and she met at, and like how she was sitting. And I thought that was the most amazing thing. So as a character, I agree with you. It's ever present and it's missing. And it's ever present also in the way that her husband sees it, or the husband's mother sees it when she comes. And then for the first time, then she has to defend a place. She's defensive of a place that she's never thought she should be defensive about. You know,
Yeah.
I thought that was
Never had to
just,
probably think about it before.
yeah.
Now suddenly she has to defend it. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was amazing. And in that same way, actually, I thought that what was amazing is and these, again, there are such light brushstrokes in this novel, but, you know, the politics of India comes up, like what India is, what India is going through right now with Modi. And it's especially prescient right now, considering today is the 5th of November and American elections are ongoing and what we're living through. And I think, like, I know, I mean, yeah, deep breath and out. But I was fascinated by that too. Like, I wonder, is it a condition of being, I don't want to say an Indian writer or a writer who's writing about India, but is it a condition of being a writer today in the world that we can't not talk about politics or religion or the things that really create the makeup of the characters we're talking about? Because in India, and I'm sure you're aware of this, like, people have screaming matches about politics and religion, and then they'll go get a cup of tea. You know, we'll argue, something that in my time in the US, I haven't seen. Like, I haven't seen real debate and argument that also allows you to then go and get chai or like go get samosa or whatever, like to go get like a coffee or whatever. And I thought that was also fascinating because you captured that moment that, yes, in the way that we live in India, it's impossible to not be constantly be talking about these other things. And and despite that, it's there in the novel and it's not there. And I was fascinated by that choice too, like to have that.
Mm-hmm. Again, this was, the Bombay riots were kind of a big deal for me when I was growing up. I would hear about them spoken of. I think we were even in India when they happened. Not in Bombay, but I think we might have been in Calcutta or Pune when they actually happened. And I heard them spoken about so much. And then later I would hear them referred to all the time. But I could never quite understand what had happened. Like I was never given the entire picture. And it was only later, again, when I was studying art history, and I came across the work of an artist, a contemporary, well, she's now deceased, an artist named Romana Hussein. And she did an amazing series of photographs of the female body alongside images of the mosque in Ayodhya. And I just thought they were just so startling and complex and beautiful. And it was just through those images that I started to do a lot more research into what had actually happened. And I think that also then fed its way into the earlier drafts of the novel in a kind of larger way. And then again, as time has passed, it became, I guess, a smaller part of the novel. But there's one particular character, Raza, who, for me, his character, I just felt that in writing his character, there was something about the riots and his character that were like deeply intertwined for me. Like I could not, just the development of that character, thinking about that character not as a victim, but thinking about a character as like a deeply complicated person with like, you know, many levels of motivation, leading him, guiding him in his life. And also a complex history of his own. I think that more than me being interested in writing about a particular historical moment or event or trauma, I couldn't leave it out because it was just so intertwined with this character's life, or what I understood this character's life to be. It was such a pivotal moment for him. And it was kind of what, in a way, led him back to Pune and led him into the life of the narrator in a way. And so, yeah, I honestly, for me, everything has to really be in service to character. Even setting, like we were talking about Pune before, the things that because everything is coming from Antara's perspective. So anything I describe about Pune, it has to be something that she would notice. You mentioned smell, and smell is important in the novel because she's obsessed with smell. She's obsessed with her own smell. And why is she obsessed with her own smell? Because she's married to this Desi from America who can't like handle, like anything except the smell of American suburbia. And so she's now like, in this kind of, I don't know, she's got this strange relationship with smell that I think continues to evolve and change throughout the novel.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, thank you for bringing up Raza, because like I was going to say that what's amazing, I think, again, the thing that makes this novel so memorable and like, again, uncomfortable is the fact that everything is through the perspective of a character, like that everything we get is filtered through these characters. And what makes it so like organic or just real, like the feeling of like, yes, these are people. And as somebody from India, like I feel like these are people I've met, or these are people that I've only seen sort of the iceberg, the bit that's up there, but just I have got glimpses of the layers below, like all of that ice below the surface. Like I've seen some of it. And I feel like this is a thing I keep telling a lot of my students who want to write about politics or who want to write, who want to use their work as social justice. I always tell them, like, you have to tell the story through a character, right? Like, because that's what matters. That's what we latch onto. Why has this book stayed with me is because the voice is unbelievable. This is this stunning, uncomfortable voice. And at the same time, we see so many people. We see so many different kinds of things. We find out so many things through Antara's perspective. Like, she has access, she does things. She lives through this particular life, and we find out all of this stuff. And the complicated relationship with the mother and daughter aren't just what has happened to her as a child, but also the decisions she makes as a young woman. And then eventually, of course, like, she chooses a more traditional life. But even within that tradition but even within the tradition, that when she begins to take her revenge, it's a traditional revenge. It's the only kind of revenge that when you have access, when your world is limited to to household activities in a way, that's the only kind of revenge that you could take. And when I was reading that, I was thinking about this. I don't know how many times I've heard these stories about family members suspecting that at some point something happened, and then families also just accepting that, just going with, like, okay, this happened. And I don't know if it's something about Indian society that allows us to, something about our family structures, something about just there's a brutality even in our sort of large family structures that we end up living in, what we call the joint family, that allows for this sort of behavior and activity sort of to get away with. But yeah, definitely, I really appreciate it. And I think people who are going to read this book are going to appreciate that fact that there are all of what it feels like to live in India has been brought to the fore. That you can't ignore, like, you cannot be living in India and ignore things. And at the same time, that you can be a middle class Indian and just totally ignore the poverty and totally ignore a lot of things. Which I think is true in the States too, or like in any country that you live, that you become inured to your circumstances, kind of. Yeah. This is such a fabulous book, and I feel like I am out of all the questions that I had thought of to ask you. Thank you so much for making time. I guess I do want to ask another question, and it's like, I think you had brought this up before, and it just struck me to ask you this is, are you able to work on anything new right now? Or is your entire focus still taken up by this book? Because I imagine, despite the fact that we're in a pandemic world, there's still promotion and there's still interviews and there's still thinking about the book. So are you able to, do you have something that you've thought about that maybe you'd work on, or right now you're just giving your permission to continue to be part of this book as much as you can be?
Honestly, with all the Booker promotional stuff that's happening and all that publicity, it's kind of another level at the moment, which is amazing, and I'm really grateful for it. But
congratulations.
Thank you. But the kind of downside of that is that I feel like I'm still very much in the world of the novel. I'm talking about it all the time, and I feel at some point I'll be able to really put it away for a little while and not think about those characters. But it is hard for me. I don't know. There are people, I think there are writers who can work on so many things simultaneously. They can have, a couple of short stories going, they can have a novel going, they can have a book of essays going. I'm really not like that. I'm terrible at multitasking of all kinds. I can focus on like one thing, one piece of work, one, idea, one character at a time. So for me, yeah, I think I'm going to need a little bit of time to decompress from all of this before I really start something new. But it will be a novel, I think, whatever I start. That seems to be the only thing I know how to write. So
I love that you said it'll be a novel. It's even when you were getting started, it had to be a novel for you. You felt like you were a long form writer. Like, you never thought short story, you never thought essay, you thought, this is it, this is the form. And does it come from somewhere? Like, is it what you grew up reading?
Yeah, I only read novels. I don't really, I was introduced to short stories so late in life. I think just in my 30s, I really started to like even know that there was a thing as a short story. I had no idea. Um, and yeah, I just love the long form. There's something
Yeah.
about it. I mean, to me, there's not really a comparison. Of course, I've read incredible short stories, and there's something so powerful about what you can do with that brevity as well. But yeah, I think I'm really just drawn to the form. It's something also I feel comfortable with, I guess.
Yeah, I feel you. I feel that same way. I feel like I was 30 before. I knew short stories, of course, like, but I didn't quite pay attention to the form and telling. I feel like the novel has, it's simultaneously cumbersome and exhausting and at the same time freeing in the way
Mm-hmm.
that it can allow you to go off and do all these interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Avni, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me. I mean, I know the Kenyon Review is really excited, and we're wishing you the very best for the Booker. And definitely, I'm rooting for you to win it. I read all the books, and at this, you know, at this level, like all the books are so great. Like to be nominated, to be in the shortlist, it's to be this, to be amongst those people is just amazing. And but still, you know, just congratulations again. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. This was really
Yeah.
fun.